It hits you sometimes, doesn't it? That moment when the floor just disappears beneath your feet. Not literally, thankfully, but that sudden, gut-wrenching lurch where everything you thought was solid ground turns out to be smoke. For me, it happened under the fluorescent lights of a conference room, surrounded by lukewarm, sparkling cider and the smell of catered appetizers. Ironic, really. It was supposed to be a celebration. My celebration. 12 years. 12 years. I'd poured into Nexus Solutions, building it, breathing life into its digital veins. We weren't just a company. We were, well, I thought we were on the verge of changing everything with Orion. My baby. This wasn't just code. It was an intricate ecosystem, an AI brain designed to revolutionize logistics, making supply chains smarter, faster, greener. It felt like magic, weaving complex algorithms and data streams into something elegant, something powerful. And it was working. Oh God, was it working? We were finally getting noticed. The big players were sniffing around, the whispers of acquisition, turning into actual conversations. Everything was pointing up, or so I believed. The air in that room buzzed, not just with the usual corporate chatter, but with anticipation. Christopher, our CEO, clinked his glass. I straightened my shoulders, ready for the praise, the acknowledgement of those endless nights fueled by coffee and sheer stubbornness, the weekends sacrificed, the personal life deferred. I saw the culmination of a third of my life about to be recognized. Christopher started talking. Usual stuff, vision, growth, the incredible journey. He mentioned my name, our brilliant lead architect, Mary, and I felt that familiar flush of pride mixed with exhaustion. He spoke about Orion's potential, the doors it was opening, and then the pivot. Smooth, almost seamless if you weren't paying attention. And as we enter this exciting new phase, he continued, his smile never wavering, it's crucial we align our leadership structure for future scalability. My stomach tightened. That phrase, align leadership structure, it's corporate. Speak, the kind that sounds positive but rarely is. It's the verbal equivalent of hiding a knife behind your back while shaking hands. Therefore, he went on, turning slightly, gesturing towards the corner of the room where he stood, I'm thrilled to announce that Scott will be stepping up to lead the Orion project moving forward. Scott, his nephew, barely 3 years out of college, nice enough kid, shadowed me for a few months supposedly to learn the ropes. Learn the ropes? I practically invented the ropes, the loom, and the whole damn textile factory. My brain just stalled. It refused to compute. Scott, leading Orion, the platform whose every nuance, every dependency, every potential point of failure existed as a complex map inside my head. The air crackled with a sudden, awkward silence before polite, confused applause rippled through the room. My applause wasn't among them. I felt cold, numb. Christopher avoided my eyes, busying himself with shaking Scott's hand, slapping him on the back. Scott, bless his heart, looked as bewildered as I felt, but tried to puff up his chest, mumbling something about being honored and excited to build on the incredible foundation Mary had laid. Build on the foundation? He barely knew where the basement was. The rest is a blur. Small talk that felt like scraping nails on slate. Forced smiles that made my face ache. Someone, I think it was Kristen from marketing before she left last year, bless her honesty, gave me this look, halfway between pity and I told you so. Christopher finally cornered me near the sad-looking cheese platter. Mary, he said, all fake sincerity, this isn't a reflection on your work truly. Your contribution has been invaluable. Invaluable. Funny word for you're out. We just need fresh energy for this next stage. A different perspective. He talked about a new strategic role for me, something vague about exploring future innovations, essentially putting me out to pasture. He didn't mention the acquisition talks with Prism Global, the multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that could swallow Nexus whole. He didn't mention that Scott, pliable and cheap, was probably a much more palatable face to put next to my work when presenting to the new potential owners. He didn't mention that my salary, reflecting 12 years of specialist expertise, was likely a line item they wanted to cut before the sale. No, he just kept smiling that empty, polished smile. I felt a wave of dizziness, the cheap cider churning, with disbelief and a rising tide of fury. How could this happen? After everything, it wasn't just a job. It was my creation, my passion, practically my identity for over a decade. And just like that, handed over to Scott. The sheer absurdity, the blatant unfairness of it all, it left me speechless, breathless. All that work, all that dedication. For this, I walked out of that conference room, leaving the forced celebration behind. The city lights seemed harsh, uncaring. My mind was racing, trying to piece it together, trying to understand the sheer audacity of it. What they didn't know, what Christopher in his infinite corporate wisdom hadn't considered, was exactly what that foundation Scott was supposed to build on was made of, and who truly held the blueprints. This wasn't just an unexpected turn. It felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind, and the consequences, they were only just beginning to unfold. But first, please like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these stories. It helps a lot. Stick around because this was just the beginning of the fight for Orion. And for myself, the drive home was strangely quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the heavy, ringing silence that follows an explosion. My hands felt disconnected. From the steering wheel, my feet operating the pedals purely on muscle memory honed over years of commuting to the place I now apparently had no real future in. The city lights, usually a comforting constellation guiding me back, seemed mocking tonight, highlighting the sharp edges of buildings like teeth in a predatory grin. That conference room, the forced smiles, Christopher's smooth, practiced. Dismissal, Scott's deer in headlights trying to look like a leader expression. It all played back in disjointed fragments, each one a fresh stab. How could 12 years unravel in 12 minutes? It felt like a betrayal wrapped in an insult shoved down my throat with a flimsy plastic fork. By the time I reached my apartment, the numbness had started to recede, replaced by a tremor that began in my hands and spread inwards. It wasn't cold, it was rage, icy and sharp, mixed with a profound, aching sense of loss. Like watching your house burn down, knowing you built it brick by painstaking brick. I didn't build Nexus Solutions itself, not the shell company, but I built its heart. Orion. I remembered the beginning, sketching architectures on napkins in a coffee shop with the original founders, long before Christopher bought them out. Back when it was just a wild idea, a what-if whispered between caffeine-fueled bursts of coding. We were going to change the world, or at least a significant slice of the logistics industry. Those early years, they were brutal. Ramen noodles. For dinner, 5 nights a week, sleeping bags unrolled under desks, debugging sessions that blurred night into day into night again. But there was this energy, this shared belief that we were creating something truly novel. We weren't just stitching together off-the-shelf components. We were building a brain, an AI that could learn, adapt, predict. It required integrating obscure machine learning libraries, developing custom data ingestion protocols, designing feedback loops that were, frankly, experimental. I remembered arguing passionately for using certain advanced frameworks, ones that required specific expertise, my expertise, to manage and optimize. Christopher, even then more focused on sales than substance, just waved it off. Make it work, Mary. Make it impressive. So I did. I poured all my creativity, my problem-solving obsession into Orion. It wasn't just lines of code. It was a reflection of my mind, intricate, sometimes maybe a little too complex, but powerful. It was my masterpiece. And apparently, Christopher thought it was just a product, a commodity he could hand off like a used car. The next morning, the rage hadn't subsided, but it had focused. The hurt was still there, a dull ache behind my ribs, but the confusion was clearing. Why now? Why Scott? Why the sudden urgency to push me aside? Then my phone buzzed. It was Kristen. She'd left Nexus 6 months ago, tired of Christopher's increasingly opaque management and lack of appreciation. "Mary," she said, her voice low, "just heard the news. Are you okay? Listen, be careful. There's serious talk about Prism Global sniffing around. Like, final stages, serious. Heard Christopher's been promising them the moon, specifically Orion's. Latest performance metrics. Prism Global. The Titan. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The timing wasn't random. The restructuring wasn't about fresh energy. It was about the acquisition. Christopher needed to present Nexus as lean, optimized, ready for takeover. And I, with my senior architect's salary and my deep, maybe slightly intimidating knowledge of the system I built, was a complication. Worse, I was expensive. Scott, his nephew, was cheap, controllable, and wouldn't ask awkward questions or demand credit during the handover to Prism. He just needed someone to stand beside the machine and smile. My machine. The calculation was so cold, so corporate. It wasn't just nepotism. It was a deliberate move to sideline me, package my life's work, and sell it with a more convenient, less costly figurehead attached. The disrespect stung almost more than the dismissal itself. He didn't just fire me. He fundamentally misunderstood my value, reducing 12 years of innovation to a line item he could slash. He thought Orion was just software Nexus owned, plug and play. But it wasn't quite that simple, was it? I started thinking about the architecture, the specific choices I'd made, those advanced ML libraries I'd insisted on. Some had complex licensing agreements I'd personally managed, the core predictive algorithms. Parts of their theoretical framework were based on research I'd done before Nexus, work I'd published and had documented carefully. Nexus had a license to use them within Orion, yes, but ownership? That was fuzzier than Christopher probably realized or cared to investigate. And the way everything was intertwined, the custom data pipelines feeding the models, the security layers, I'd implemented after that near-disastrous breach attempt 2 years ago. It wasn't a simple machine you could just hand the keys over for. It was a temperamental beast, powerful but demanding, and it only truly responded to its creator. Me. Scott wouldn't know where to even begin if something went sideways. Christopher, in his rush to tidy up the company for sale, had potentially thrown away the instruction manual and kept only the glossy cover. A flicker of something that wasn't despair sparked within me. It felt interesting. The game wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning, on a playing field Christopher hadn't even realized existed. He thought he'd sidelined me. He might have just unleashed his biggest problem. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He wanted my work without me. Let's see how well that works out for him. The righteous anger was still simmering, a pilot light of fury deep inside, but feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to change anything. Christopher saw me as disposable, a cog easily swapped out. Scott was the shiny new replacement part. Fine, but if I was just a cog, I was a damned critical one, intricately connected to the machine's very core, and I had a suspicion they hadn't bothered to check the engineering specs before deciding to pull me out. It was time to stop reacting and start thinking strategically. This wasn't just about feeling wronged. It was about protecting 12 years of intellectual and emotional investment. Orion wasn't just Nexus's asset. Parts of it were fundamentally mine, woven from threads Christopher likely never even saw, let alone understood. So, I started digging. Late into the night, fueled by coffee that tasted more like defiance than caffeine, I pulled up my original employment contract. Then the amendments, the project charters for Orion's various phases. And crucially, my notes and documentation, from before I even joined Nexus. The research papers, the early algorithm sketches, the foundational work that had attracted the original founders in the first place. It was all coming back. The arguments over using certain open-source components with tricky licensing. Christopher just wanted fast results. I'd insisted on compliance, carefully tracking dependencies and attributions. Did anyone else even remember those discussions? Doubtful. Then there was the core machine learning engine itself. A significant chunk of its architecture stemmed directly from my doctoral research. Nexus had been granted a generous, exclusive license to use and build upon it within their product. Yes, but ownership of that foundational IP never explicitly transferred. It was a nuance, a detail buried in legalese that seemed unimportant years ago when we were all just excited about building something cool. Now, it felt like a potential fortress wall. I cross-referenced my old research documentation with specific modules within Orion's codebase. The lineage was clear, traceable, documented. And then there were the third-party libraries, the specialized tools I'd integrated to give Orion its edge. Some required commercial licenses, renewed periodically. Licenses I had managed? Often. Under budget lines Christopher barely glanced at. Would Scott, in his eagerness to impress, even know these existed, let alone when they expired or how critical they were? The thought sent a grim little thrill through me. This wasn't something I could navigate alone, though. I needed perspective, maybe validation. I hesitated, then reached out to Kristen and Steven. Both had left Nexus disillusioned with Christopher's leadership. Kristen frustrated by the constant over-promising and under-delivering in marketing. Steven tired of technical debt being ignored in favor of flashy demos. We met discreetly at a small cafe miles away from the tech district, the almost clatter of cups a stark contrast to the hushed intensity of our conversation. I laid it out. The dismissal, Scott's appointment, the Prism rumors, my suspicions about Christopher's motives. I saw the initial shock on their faces turn into something harder, a knowing resignation. They weren't surprised by the ruthlessness, just the target. "He's packaging it for sale, Mary," Kristen confirmed, swirling her latte. "He's been whining and dining Prism executives for weeks, promising them seamless integration, state-of-the-art, turnkey AI." She snorted. "Turnkey? With Scott driving?" Steven, always more measured, leaned forward. "Architecturally, Mary, Orion is brilliant, but it's bespoke. It's got your fingerprints all over it. Remember that data serialization format we argued about? The one you insisted on for efficiency? Nobody else knows its quirks. And the way you balanced the loads across those specific server instances? Scott wouldn't have a clue. If Prism does serious technical due diligence, they'll see the gaps the moment they look under the hood without you there. I explained my findings about the licenses and the foundational IP from my research. Steven's eyes widened slightly. "He doesn't own that core logic." "He has the right to use it," I clarified. "But selling the company, transferring ownership of Orion as a whole package, including that specific IP, the agreements might not cover that cleanly, especially if the original creator isn't there to ensure its proper use or transition." Kristen tapped her finger on the table. "This changes things. If Prism thinks they're buying a fully self-contained asset, but key components rely on licenses you control or IP you technically own." She trailed off, a slow smile spreading across her face. Christopher might have a problem. It wasn't about sabotage. Let me be clear. I didn't want Orion to fail. It was still my baby. But I couldn't let Christopher sell it off under false pretenses, erasing my contribution and potentially letting its potential wither under incompetent management. This was about asserting the truth, my value. Steven agreed to discreetly look over some old technical documentation I still had access to, confirming dependencies. Kristen offered to keep an ear to the ground, filtering any rumors about the Prism deal's progress. Walking away from that cafe, I felt less like a victim, and more like a player in a game I hadn't asked to join, but one I was suddenly equipped to play. I spent the next few days meticulously organizing everything: emails, license agreement PDFs, code snippets cross-referenced with my research papers, timelines, building my case, not for a lawsuit, not yet anyway, but for leverage, for the moment when Christopher's shortcut inevitably hit a dead end. He thought he'd cleared the board. He had no idea he'd left the most powerful piece in play. It started subtly, just whispers at first, relayed through Kristen's network and Steven's remaining contacts inside Nexus. Christopher, apparently, was strutting around like he'd already won the lottery, slapping backs and talking about synergy. Scott was trying his best to look busy and important, attending high-level meetings he clearly wasn't equipped for, nodding along while frantically Googling technical terms under the table. Or so Steven suspected. They pushed forward with the Prism Global acquisition talks, moving into the dreaded technical due diligence phase. This wasn't about glossy presentations anymore. This was Prism's team, seasoned engineers and architects kicking the tires. Hard. They wanted deep dives into Orion's architecture, stress tests, integration proofs of concept. They wanted to see the engine, not just the shiny paint job. And that's when the carefully constructed facade began to crack. Kristen forwarded me an internal memo someone had leaked to her. Subject line: urgent, prepping Orion for Prism deep dive. It was full of buzzwords and vague action items, assigned primarily to Scott. Reading between the lines, it screamed panic. Then came the first real tremor. Prism requested a live demo focusing on Orion's real-time adaptive learning capabilities, one of the most complex modules, heavily reliant on those specific ML libraries with the tricky licenses I used to manage. Stephen called me that evening, his voice a mix of disbelief and dark amusement. "Mary, you won't believe this. Scott tried to run the demo. It crashed. Mid-presentation, in front of the entire Prism Tech lead team. Apparently, a crucial license for a visualization component tied to the ML output had expired 3 days earlier. Something I would have renewed proactively, but it wasn't even on Scott's radar. He tried to reboot, made excuses about network, latency, but the Prism guys weren't buying it. They started asking sharp questions about the underlying data models, error handling, failover protocols. Scott just froze, offered generic answers that made it painfully obvious he had no real depth of understanding. The fallout was immediate. Christopher, according to Kristen's sources, went ballistic behind closed doors. The blame game started. Scott apparently tried to point fingers at legacy code issues. My code, naturally, but even Christopher wasn't stupid enough to buy. That completely, especially when the system had been running flawlessly just weeks before. The pressure intensified. Prism sent over a list of highly technical questions, demanding detailed architectural diagrams, documentation for the core algorithms, and clarification on third-party dependencies and their licensing status. This hit the second landmine. Scott couldn't produce diagrams for aspects of the system only I had fully mapped out. Worse, when questioned directly about the provenance of the core predictive engine, the part derived from my pre-Nexus research, he gave vague, conflicting answers that set off major red flags for Prism's IP lawyers. They wanted clear proof of ownership, clear chain of title for all critical components. Nexus couldn't provide it for the very heart of Orion. Then came the final straw. Prism attempted a simulated integration test, trying to feed Orion a massive, complex dataset to test its scalability and processing efficiency, precisely what Stephen had warned about regarding the custom data serialization and load balancing. The system choked, performance plummeted, alerts started firing in the back-end systems, cryptic error messages related to resource allocation and data pipeline bottlenecks that Scott lacking the intricate knowledge of how I'd optimize those. Pathways couldn't decipher, let alone fix. Stephen heard about the frantic all-night sessions, Scott snapping at the junior engineers, Christopher pacing like a caged tiger, his face pale. The carefully curated image of a seamless, powerful turnkey AI solution evaporated under scrutiny. What Prism saw instead was a complex, obviously powerful system that was suddenly unstable and seemingly unmanageable by its current supposed lead. They saw risk. Massive risk. The call came from Kristen late one night. "They paused it, Mary," she said, her voice tight. Prism put the acquisition on hold indefinitely, cited significant concerns regarding platform stability, architectural documentation, and unresolved questions about intellectual property ownership. There it was, the consequence. Christopher's gamble, his arrogant dismissal of my role, his assumption that the magic was in the machine itself and not the magician. It had backfired spectacularly. He hadn't just sidelined me, he'd inadvertently revealed that the core value proposition he was trying to sell was inextricably tied to the very person he'd pushed out the door. The silence on the other end of... The line felt heavy, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the quiet before the next move. The ball was no longer in Christopher's court. It felt like it was rolling slowly, inevitably, towards mine. The silence from Nexus was deafening. After Prism officially put the acquisition on ice, citing those significant concerns, the internal chaos apparently reached fever pitch. Kristen heard Christopher had several meltdowns, oscillating between blaming Scott, blaming the market, blaming cosmic injustice, anyone but himself. Scott, stripped of his unearned authority and exposed as utterly out of his depth, was quietly reassigned to some undefined special projects role, effectively vanishing from relevance. The dream of a quick, lucrative exit for Nexus evaporated, leaving behind a company shaken, its star asset revealed as critically dependent on the very architect they'd cast aside. There was a grim sort of justice in it, though it tasted more like ashes than champagne. Watching something you poured your soul into falter is never truly satisfying, even when it validates your worth. It felt like watching a magnificent ship, one you helped design and build, taking on water because the current captain threw the navigator overboard. Then, about 2 weeks after the Prism deal collapsed, I got an email. Not from Christopher. Not from anyone still clinging to the wreckage at Nexus. It was from Eleanor Vance, the Executive VP of Technology Strategy at Prism Global. The subject line was simple: following up on Orion. My heart did a weird little jump. Not panic this time, but anticipation. We met for coffee, then lunch. There was no pretense, no corporate doublespeak. Eleanor was direct. Prism had been genuinely impressed by Orion's potential. The potential they'd glimpsed before the disastrous due diligence phase. They recognized its power, but they also recognized, belatedly, that its stability and future development were tied to a deep, intrinsic understanding they currently lacked. They knew Scott wasn't the answer. They suspected, correctly, that I was. They had done their homework after the deal paused, likely digging into Orion's history, my publications, maybe even talking to former Nexus employees. They understood the nuances of the IP situation better than Christopher ever did. Suddenly, the tables were completely turned. I wasn't the discarded employee. I was the missing keystone. The negotiation wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. They wanted Orion, or at least access to its core technology and the mind behind it. I had leverage, and I wasn't afraid to use it, not for revenge, but for respect and control. We talked terms. Yes, financial compensation was part of it, significantly better than my old Nexus package. But more importantly, we talked about structure. I wasn't interested in just being an employee again, reporting up a long chain of command. I insisted on leading a new semi-autonomous division within Prism, dedicated specifically to developing and ethically deploying Orion's technology. I wanted final say on the technical roadmap. I wanted guarantees about maintaining the platform's integrity, ensuring it wasn't just stripped for parts or misused. I laid out my conditions regarding the foundational IP I brought into Nexus: clear licensing, proper attribution, respecting its origins. Eleanor didn't blink. She listened, asked clarifying questions, and ultimately she agreed. Prism wasn't just acquiring code. They were investing in the vision and the visionary. They needed me, and they knew it. So here I am. It's different. Starting over in a massive corporation like Prism has its own challenges, navigating new structures, new politics, but there's a profound sense of validation. My work, my contribution, wasn't just acknowledged. It was deemed indispensable. Orion has a future now, a chance to actually realize the potential I always knew it had, backed by resources Nexus could only dream of. And I get to guide it. As for Nexus, last I heard, Christopher was desperately seeking other buyers. But the word was out. The company was eventually acquired, but for a fraction of the original Prism offer, mostly for its client list. Orion itself, without me, and with its IP complexities exposed, was seen as too much of a liability. Christopher didn't get his triumphant exit. Looking back, it's still a whirlwind. The betrayal cut deep, and rebuilding trust, even in a new environment, takes time. There's a scar there, a reminder of how quickly things can change, how loyalty can be a one-way street in the corporate world. It forced me to confront my own value, to understand the legal and strategic power tied to intellectual creation, something I'd naively overlooked for years while focused solely on the joy of building. It taught me that passion is vital, but so is protecting your contribution. You can pour your heart into your work, but you need to keep the blueprint safe, just in case someone tries to claim the whole building and lock you out. It's a complex feeling. Relief, vindication, a touch of sadness for the what-ifs at Nexus, but mostly a quiet strength. I didn't just survive being thrown under the bus, I learned how to drive it. So, that's my story. A reminder, I guess, that sometimes the biggest setbacks can lead to unexpected opportunities, and that knowing your worth and defending it is crucial. It makes me wonder, though, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought back, walked away, or handled it differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely love to hear them. And if you want to hear more stories like this, about navigating challenges, finding resilience, and maybe a little bit of workplace drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching.